This lecture is going to introduce evolution and specifically the role of adaptation in evolution. So we'll talk about natural selection, we'll introduce the concept of fitness, and we'll talk about the role that mutations play in providing variation on which natural selection can operate so that it can eventually produce adaptations. To understand animal diversity, really what we have to understand are two concepts regarding evolution. First of all, we have to think about what an adaptation is. And then we can track adaptations by understanding the pattern of relatedness among the major animal lineages. And evolution was first defined in a scientific manner by these two gentlemen, basically at the same time, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. They actually looked fairly similar, don't they? Charles Darwin on the left, Alfred Russel Wallace on the right, and their contribution to really describing how evolution works, because there had been some previous individuals that had talked about evolution in vague terms, but these individuals are the ones who introduced the concept of natural selection. And Darwin described evolution as descent with modification, and that's not really a formal definition, but it's a great description of what's going on. See, we have a series of descendants and ancestors, and the ancestors have been modified in what the characteristics that the ancestors had have been modified in the descendants. So there's change in their morphology, their physiology, and their behavior from generation to generation. So evolution is the result of changes in heritable traits as they change in a lineage of organisms across generations. So from one generation to the next, heritable traits change in a lineage. Well, let's try to break down some of these terms that I'm talking about. What is a trait? A trait is a physical or behavioral characteristic, such as leg length, if a good example of morphology or anatomy, how an animal might be able to physiologically regulate its body temperature, or some behavioral aspect of how it attracts a mate to pass on its genes. So I'm going to give you this kind of example. We'll kind of follow through much of this lecture. Here we have two different frogs, perhaps of the same species, and they're different sizes. And one of the traits that we may be interested in is their leg length. All right, so that's what a trait is, but what does it mean to be a heritable trait? What does heritable mean? This means that that trait has a strong genetic basis. And this is important because a trait has to be heritable for it to be able to evolve. Because genotypes are passed from parent to offspring. And this is what determines the phenotype in the offspring that are formed. So we have body size and leg length. So small frogs produce small offspring. Large frogs produce large offsprings with large legs. Okay, I've introduced a couple of new terms. Let's get those down. So I said individuals with different genotypes represent different alleles. Okay, so we've got genotypes, alleles, and these are linked to the production of different phenotypes. So an allele is a version of a gene. So each genotype, the specific combination of DNA sequence that the A's, G's, C's, and T's in that DNA sequence, at a gene locus, the locus is the spot on the DNA where that gene is. But different genotypes that differ in the specific sequence of those nitrogenous bases produce different alleles. And a different allele produces a different phenotype. Okay, so what is the phenotype? Well, the phenotype is the physical manifestation of what the gene says to make. So it's the trait that we actually see in nature. So a phenotype could be a behavior. It could be something like, in this case, the leg length. So a leg of 36.2 millimeters versus 142.6 millimeters. Those are different phenotypes. And if it's a heritable trait, that is linked to those frogs having different alleles at that genotype. So that's an example of a continuous trait. We could also have traits that we break down as like presence or absence. So having hair or not having hair. those are different phenotypes that potentially, if it is a heritable trait, that means that it's linked to different genotypes, and so there is an allele for production of hair and an allele in other organisms for the failure to produce that hair. Now, another term I use is a lineage. What is a lineage of organisms? So a lineage is a population of individuals of a species that passes alleles from one generation to the next. So it's a reproductively capable group of individuals in a species, a localized group of those individuals that are reproducing, and they're producing their current gene pool into the next generation's gene pool. Now, this is important because I keep talking about one generation to the next, because we see evolution occurring when genotype frequencies and the frequencies of different alleles change in a lineage across generations. So let's give an example of that. Here we have a population of rabbits, perhaps, and the typical phenotype is to be a white rabbit. Well, that's because if you look at the gene pool, all of the alleles, all of the loci associated with hair production have genotypes that have the allele for the production of that color pelage. But let's say we get a mutation, perhaps, and we see the production of one that produces melanin in its hair. So now we have a different, we still have that gene locus, but we have a different genotype, a different allele that is producing a different phenotype. A few generations later, we may see that the frequency of the brown phenotype is increasing relative to the white phenotype. And eventually it may completely overwhelm the population such that it completely eliminates the white pelaged rabbits. So that's an example of evolution. We see generation after generation changes in the gene pool, changes in the allele frequencies associated with various genotypes at different gene loci. Now, why we see this change will vary. We'll give an example later of one of the evolutionary mechanisms that could be explaining what's going on here, called natural selection. But there are other possible explanations for why this pattern was seen here. Well, we can talk about genetic change through time at two different relative scales. What I was just really describing there with the rabbits was microevolution. That's evolution within a species, and it's a relative minor degree of change. So we're talking about relatively minor changes in allele frequencies and genotype frequencies. But the minimum time frame which you can measure any change in that gene pool is between generations. You can't have evolution occur within a generation. So again, here we were talking about an example that went from one generation to 100 generations, and we see that through those generational time, we saw this gradual shift from a gene pool of all white rabbits to all brown rabbits. And it's important to realize that if that is the scale at which microevolution occurs, different lineages will evolve at different rates. So the lineage with the faster generation time has the potential for more rounds of evolution. So a fruit fly has the potential to evolve much more quickly than an elephant population. So in 25 years, which is basically the average generation time for an African elephant, you can have over 900 generations of fruit flies. So with changes in environments, we see that there is a much greater potential for adaptation in a set time frame for something like a fruit fly compared to an elephant. And this has pretty important conservation consequences for the ability to rectify problems in endangered species depending on their generation time. Another time frame associated with evolution is what we call macroevolution. This is more long-term accumulated patterns of the microevolutionary change that we've discussed so far. And this is typically studied above the species level. So for example, the evolution of birds and the characteristics of birds, like the origin of feathers, the evolution and change in wing shape in birds. And this has been a pretty big area of research, And by having different new fossil finds in China, we've clearly established that really birds are dinosaurs. And we have a great series of transitional fossils showing the evolution of the traits that now we define as birds, having existed in different forms in earlier lineages, such that it's difficult to define when birds started. So what are the non-avian dinosaurs versus the avian dinosaurs? There was a very gradual change in feather morphology and the development of wings. All right, so we need to introduce another term. Individuals who pass on the most copies of their genes, those are the individuals that are going to contribute more to the next generation's gene pool. So they're going to have a greater influence on the relative evolutionary changes in that species. So here's something that you're going to hear from me quite a bit these days. The goal of all organisms is to pass on as many copies of your genes into future generations as possible. And I don't mean this as like a conscious thing, but organisms that have the greater ability to pass on those genes, they are going to drive the evolution of their species more. And so traits that allow an individual to do that are those that are going to be selected for. Now, individuals that maximize this evolutionary goal are said to be fit. And fitness is a measure of your ability to pass on these genes to subsequent generations. And we call this evolutionary fitness. It's the ability of individuals to continue that genetic lineage, their specific genes, relative to competing genetic lineages in their same population, so that they control more what the gene pool is like. So high relative fitness means greater evolutionary success for those individuals. And so it's important to think about fitness in this evolutionary sense, not thinking about it as simply physical fitness. Physical fitness may allow you to have greater fitness, but just surviving and being healthy isn't going to be enough if you don't pass on your genes, if you can't reproduce successfully. All right, so thinking about that as the goal of organisms, of what really drives the direction of evolution of a species by different individuals having different levels of fitness, let's talk about the evolutionary mechanism linked to the production of traits that give an individual a greater edge in maximizing their fitness. Natural selection really is the key evolutionary mechanism that does this. It leads to the formation of traits that are called adaptations. These are traits that increase the fitness of individuals. So adaptations are traits that increase the survival and reproduction of individuals, with, again, really focusing on reproduction, because it doesn't do any good to merely survive. So let's look at an example of that. It may be the case that the brown rabbits, in some regard, have higher survival, but that may be linked to them being still more often so they can blend in with the background, and as such, they don't meet up with other rabbits, they don't reproduce very much. So they may survive much more frequently than the white rabbits that have a lower survivorship. But if the white rabbits are the ones out there reproducing at a much higher level, and these guys just really aren't reproducing, then the brown pelage isn't going to increase in fitness. It is not a fit trait. Despite the fact that it increases survival, it's not reproducing. It's not leading to increased reproduction. So how does natural selection work? Well, natural selection works first with a series of prerequisites. So let's look at what those prerequisites are. First is you have to look within a species and see that individuals are different. They have to show variation in morphology or behavior, whatever the trait of interest is. And secondly, that these traits have to be heritable. Again, this means that the traits are passed from parents to offspring. They have a strong genetic basis. So here's an example of this. We have a population of flies, and I drew these myself. Pretty proud of that. And you see that some of these flies have little stubby wings, some of them have medium-sized wings, some of these have big mongo wings, right? Okay, so we meet our first prerequisite. There is variation in the morphology. And let's assume that that when big-winged flies mate together, they produce big-winged offspring, small-winged flies produce small-winged offspring, and so forth, so that there is a heritable basis to this trait variation. The third part of natural selection is really the most important. I mean, the other two are important because you can't get to this third stage unless those exist. But this is where the rubber really meets the road. So the third requirement says that the trait variation is consequential. It means that there is different levels of survival and reproduction, different fitness consequences to having different wings, so that different traits lead to different fitness levels. And so individuals with the better trait forms, the phenotypes associated with greater survival and reproduction, if they're reproducing at a higher rate, they have higher fitness. They identify what the adaptation is, and they're going to be passing on the genes for that adaptation in greater frequencies to the next generation, so that the population will change through time to have a greater frequency of those genes and those phenotypes. So here we may have a situation where these small-winged flies, in some years where food is kind of limiting, they just can't locomote efficiently. Maybe they can't fly at all, and so they can't fly to these widely spaced patches of food, and so they starve before they can reproduce maybe at all. These medium-winged flies, they can fly, but they're not as efficient, and so they tend to struggle in finding the food. And when they do find the food, they can maybe eat some of it and reproduce some. But perhaps these individuals with the giant wings, they may have just really amazingly successful aerodynamics. They can get to the food faster. They get the highest quality food. They use most of that resource. And because they get there really quickly and they feed as much as they want, they can use the rest of their time reproducing. So they're healthier, they have more time to reproduce, and so they may pass on their genes. They may have higher fitness. And so in subsequent generations, we should see an increase in the frequency of big-winged individuals in subsequent generations, perhaps even eliminating these other phenotypes and their associated genotypes. All right, well, let's talk about how do we get to that first prerequisite of natural selection. Remember, there has to be variation in the phenotypes associated with the trait that we're interested in. Individuals can't be the same. So you have to think about natural selection as being a filtering process. If everybody's the same, there's nothing to filter. So how do we get that variation? Well, that ultimately comes from mutations. Mutations are errors during the replication process, so that you produce copies of DNA that are not quite accurate, or the placement of the genes relative to each other in the genome may vary on a DNA strand or among chromosomes. But there's something wrong with the replication process. So it could be as simple as this. So the top series of nucleotides here represent maybe the original genotype and the original allele, but at the same locus, when it reproduces, it may make a copy that has replaced this T with a G. Okay, that is a mutation. That's just changed one nucleotide and it's produced a different allele. Now, other more extreme mutations could include duplicating an entire chromosome or entire set of genes duplicating a gene, or even an entire set of chromosomes. The entire genome may double. That's called polyploidization. And it's important to understand that mutations are random, and the effect of the mutation is going to vary. A lot of mutations actually have no effect on the phenotype. So that previous example where we just changed that one nucleotide, it may have actually, technically it's a different genotype, but it may not change the phenotype at all. And that's just kind of how gene expression works. We're not going to have time to really go through that in this class. But if you remember, the third position of a codon really doesn't matter which amino acid you're going to get. So some mutations just really aren't going to change the phenotype at all. And so from an evolutionary perspective, those mutations are silent. They're invisible. Now, When you do have a change, a change in a genotype that changes the phenotype, typically that's a deleterious trait. So it messes with the functioning of whatever that gene product was. Whatever the protein produced, it's not going to work as well, or it could completely make it not work at all. So that's typically what happens. Those are mutations or deleterious, and natural selection is going to weed those out. But very rarely we get mutations that produce an improvement to whatever the gene product was, so that we get a more adaptive phenotype. And see, this is when natural selection is important. This is when natural selection can lead to an increase in this new beneficial mutation. So remember, let's say we had a population of flies that all had the little stubby wings, and we get a mutation for this individual with the larger wings. Again, if this individual has greater fitness by finding more food and perhaps enticing more of the females, if this is a male, enticing more of the females, or it could be a female enticing more males to mate, regardless, it's going to be passing on more copies of its genes into the next generation. And so natural selection will increase the frequency of this more adaptive phenotype. But it's important to realize that animals can't deliberately cause beneficial mutations to occur. Again, mutations are random. If you get a mutation that provides a better adaptive phenotype, you should see an increase in that phenotype. But animals can't look forward and say, climate change is going to cause an increase in drought in this area, so we need to cause the mutation of drought-resistant genes if you're, say, a pine tree. No, they can't do that. If there's a mutation that produces a more drought-tolerant individual and the climate does change in that way, sure, that will be the more adaptive phenotype and will increase in frequency due to natural selection. But mutations, as they're generated, are just random. And as I mentioned, mutations have variation in whether they have an effect or not. And sometimes they can affect a single phenotypic trait, like eye color. So you may have a gene locus with different alleles that produce different colored eyes. But it's just really a change in that one of those alleles or the other only affects eye color. But from an evolutionary perspective, some of the more important mutations are mutations that simultaneously affect numerous traits. This is very common in developmental genes. So you may have a developmental gene that has these what we call pleiotropic effects. So it may affect this one gene changing. A mutation in this one gene may change the relative size of both the forelimbs, the hind limbs, and maybe the tail lengths of certain organisms. And that's oftentimes what we see when we see kind of scaling in different traits in an organism, like a big frog versus a small frog. As it gets bigger, it doesn't increase just in body size, but the relative lengths of its limbs are going to increase as well. It's also important to realize that only mutations in reproductive or gametic cells are going to have any kind of influence from an evolutionary perspective. Somatic body cell mutations do occur, and they can cause things like cancer, but they're not going to have any long-term cascading effect generation to generation because they don't make it into the gene pool. Now, one exception for that would be asexually reproducing organisms because they can use different parts of their somatic tissue to reproduce. But typically, for a sexually reproducing organism, it's only the gametes, the reproductive cells, so the sperm and the eggs, the mutations in those pieces, the DNA in those cells, those are the only ones that are going to have evolutionary consequences. So in review, went over quite a few definitions. Make sure you know the definition of traits, lineages, what a heritable trait is, what an allele is, what a genotype is, a phenotype, and know what evolution is. Think about how Darwin defined it, but really it's just genetic change across generations. And at different scales, it can be within a species, that's microevolution, or kind of longer-term accumulations of those patterns above the species level, and the associated traits in those major lineages, though that's an example of macroevolution. We talked about what an adaptation is. An adaptation is a trait that leads to increased survival and reproduction, which namely means it increases an individual's fitness. And make sure you understand what fitness is. It's the ability of individuals to pass on copies of their genes to subsequent generations. So it's a competitive venture between individuals of the same species. And individuals, their goal is to maximize their fitness. Not to just reproduce once, but to reproduce as many copies of their genes into offspring as possible. Then we talked about how natural selection is the evolutionary mechanism that molds adaptations. And for natural selection to work, you have to have variation in traits among individuals in a population. Those traits have to be heritable, meaning they have a genetic basis. And there are consequences to having different phenotypes associated with that trait. So there are different trait-based fitnesses. So the individuals with the better traits have better fitness, they're more adaptive, and so the frequency of those adaptive phenotypes are going to increase in subsequent generations. But mutation is really important in providing that variation in phenotypes, genotypes that provide the variation in the phenotypes that natural selection can operate on. But realize mutations are random, and the effect of a mutation can vary, both in whether it has an effect or not, and also the scale of the mutation, whether it's going to affect one trait or multiple traits. The next video, we're going to continue our discussion of evolutionary biology, but we're going to jump to the macroevolutionary scale. We're going to talk about how we can use phylogenies to reimagine animal classifications and track adaptive evolution in major lineages of animals.